There are moments in history when the impossible becomes possible, when everything you thought you knew about human capability gets shattered in an instant. This is one of those moments. March 17, 2019. A packed auditorium in San Francisco. 300 of the world's most brilliant minds gathered under one roof. Mathematicians who'd solved equations that stumped generations. Engineers who'd built technologies that changed civilization. AI developers whose machines could beat grandmasters at chess in seconds. And in the center of that stage, behind reinforced glass, sat a puzzle that had destroyed every single one of them. For 30 years, this puzzle had been a legend, a myth, an obsession that consumed careers and shattered egos. Some called it the Lockwood Enigma, named after the billionaire who'd commissioned it. Others simply called it the Unsolvable. The rules were simple, brutal, and absolute. You got one attempt, 24 hours, $500 million if you succeeded, public humiliation if you failed. And failure was all anyone had ever known. Standing at that podium was Marcus Daniels, tech billionaire, inventor, philanthropist, the man who'd brought this puzzle back from obscurity after it had been locked away for decades. His voice carried across that silent auditorium with the weight of absolute certainty. "This puzzle cannot be solved by ordinary minds," he said, his eyes scanning the room with something that looked almost like pity. "It never has been. It never will be." The audience nodded. They'd heard the stories. 30 years ago, when the puzzle first appeared, it had been designed by a reclusive genius named Robert Lockwood, a man whose IQ reportedly exceeded 180, whose mathematical proofs had revolutionized 3 different fields before he turned 30. He'd created this puzzle as a gift for his wife, Eleanor, a woman he'd married in secret, a woman whose identity remained mysterious even to those closest to him. The puzzle was supposed to be a tribute to their love, a mechanical marvel that encoded their story in layers of complexity so profound that only someone who truly understood them could unlock it. But 6 months after he presented it to her, Eleanor Lockwood vanished. No body, no evidence, no explanation, just gone, as if she'd never existed at all. Robert Lockwood fell apart. He became obsessed with his own creation, convinced that Eleanor had left him a message inside the puzzle, a clue to where she'd gone or what had happened to her. He spent years trying to solve it himself, the very puzzle he'd designed. But something had changed in its mechanism, something he didn't understand. He died in 2003, alone in his estate, the puzzle still locked, its secret still hidden. The puzzle passed through various hands over the years. Collectors bought it, universities studied it. Intelligence agencies tried to crack it, thinking it might contain state secrets or encryption keys worth billions. Every attempt ended the same way, in failure, frustration, and the growing legend that this puzzle was simply beyond human capability. And then Marcus Daniels bought it. $10 million at a private auction in 2018. He announced he was bringing it back to the public, offering that staggering $500 million reward to anyone who could solve it. The tech world went insane. Applications flooded in from every corner of the globe. Daniels selected only the best, the absolute elite, and one by one, they tried and failed. Spectacular failures, public failures, failures that ended careers and shattered reputations. By March 2019, the puzzle had become more than a challenge. It had become a symbol of human limitation, proof that some things were simply meant to remain locked forever. The conference that day was supposed to be a celebration of innovation, of pushing boundaries, of human potential. Instead, it had become a funeral for hope. The puzzle sat there in its case like a tombstone, a reminder of what brilliance could not achieve. And that's when she stood up. From the very back of the auditorium, from a section reserved for staff and support personnel, a woman rose from her seat. She was 59 years old, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing a cleaning service uniform with her name embroidered on the chest. Sarah Mitchell. Most people in that room didn't even notice her at first. She wasn't supposed to be part of the event, wasn't supposed to speak, wasn't supposed to exist in that space of genius and achievement. She was invisible in the way that working people often are, present but unseen, necessary but unacknowledged. But Sarah Mitchell started walking down the aisle toward that stage, and something about her movement made people turn. There was a determination in her stride, a quiet intensity that cut through the ambient noise of the auditorium. By the time she reached the front, security guards were already moving to intercept her. Marcus Daniels looked down from the stage, his expression shifting from confusion to irritation. "Ma'am, this is a closed event," he said, his voice carrying that particular tone that powerful people use when addressing those they consider beneath them. "I need you to return to your station." Sarah Mitchell stopped at the base of the stage. She looked up at him, and in her eyes was something that made him pause. Not anger, not desperation, just absolute, unshakable certainty. "I can solve it," she said. Her voice was quiet, steady, without drama or performance. "I can solve the puzzle." The auditorium erupted in laughter. Not cruel laughter exactly, but the kind of laughter that comes from surprise and disbelief. The kind that happens when someone says something so absurd that it breaks tension. A cleaning woman, solving the unsolvable, when Nobel laureates had failed, when artificial intelligence had failed, when 3 decades of the world's best minds had failed. Marcus Daniels smiled, and it was not a kind smile. "Ma'am, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this puzzle has defeated experts in cryptography, mathematics, mechanical engineering, and cognitive science. With all due respect, I don't think I can solve it," Sarah repeated, and this time there was steel in her voice. "You announced open applications. You said anyone could try. Those were your exact words in the press release 6 months ago. Anyone with the courage to attempt the impossible. I'm attempting." The laughter died down. People were leaning forward now, curious despite themselves. Marcus Daniels's smile faded. He looked at her for a long moment, and something flickered across his face. Something that might have been concern or might have been fear. It was hard to tell. "If you fail," he said slowly, "your attempt will be recorded and broadcast. You understand that? The whole world will see." "I understand," Sarah said. "Then, you'll need to sign the waiver," Daniels said, and there was something odd about his tone now, something that suggested he wanted her to refuse, to back down, to disappear back into the shadows where she belonged. But Sarah Mitchell walked onto that stage, took the pen that was offered to her, and signed her name on the waiver without hesitation. The crowd had gone completely silent now. This wasn't entertainment anymore. This was something else, something uncomfortable, like watching someone walk toward the edge of a cliff. The puzzle was brought forward, removed from its protective case, and placed on a table in front of her. It was beautiful in a cold, mechanical way, about the size of a shoebox, made from what looked like brushed titanium and dark wood, covered in symbols that seemed to shift and change depending on the angle of light. There were dials and switches and panels that slid in ways that didn't seem physically possible, components that appeared to exist in impossible configurations. Sarah reached out and touched it for the first time, and the timer began. 24 hours. The rules were explained to her, though she didn't seem to be listening. She would be taken to a private room where cameras would record her every move. She could not leave. She could not communicate with anyone. She could request food and water, but that was all. If she solved it, the mechanism would unlock and reveal whatever was hidden inside. If she failed, if the timer ran out, the puzzle would permanently seal itself, and its contents would be lost forever. Marcus Daniels himself would oversee the attempt from a separate monitoring room. The audience would be updated every few hours. Sarah nodded through all of this, her hands already exploring the surface of the puzzle, her fingers tracing patterns that no one else could see. They led her away to the isolation room, and the auditorium slowly emptied. People returning to their hotels and conference sessions, already composing social media posts about the cleaning woman who thought she could succeed where geniuses had failed. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. But what none of them knew, what none of them could have known, was who Sarah Mitchell really was. The name on her uniform was real, but it wasn't the name she'd been born with. She'd been born Sarah Lockwood in 1960, in a small town in Indiana that doesn't exist on maps anymore. Her father was Robert Lockwood, the genius who'd created the puzzle. Her mother was Eleanor Lockwood, the woman who'd disappeared. Sarah had been 8 years old when her mother vanished, old enough to remember everything, old enough to understand that something terrible had happened, old enough to know that her father's grief was mixed with something else, something darker, something that looked almost like guilt. After Eleanor disappeared, Robert Lockwood changed. He became obsessed with the puzzle, working on it day and night, barely acknowledging that his daughter existed. Sarah grew up in the shadow of that obsession, watching her father destroy himself, trying to unlock something he'd created, trying to find a message he was convinced was hidden inside. When she was 16, Sarah left, changed her name, built a new life far away from the puzzle and the mystery and the tragedy that had consumed her family. She became an engineer, got married, had a daughter of her own. She tried to forget about the puzzle, about her father, about the mother she'd lost. But some things don't stay buried. In 2003, when her father died, Sarah received a package. Inside was a letter, written in her father's shaking handwriting, composed in the final weeks of his life. The letter said things that Sarah had suspected but never confirmed. The puzzle wasn't really her father's creation. It was her mother's. Eleanor Lockwood had been the true genius in the family, a mathematician whose work was so far ahead of its time that she couldn't get it published, couldn't get anyone to take her seriously, because she was a woman working in the 1,980 seconds in a field dominated by men who refused to believe that brilliance could come from someone like her. So she'd hidden her work, encoded it, built it into a mechanical puzzle that her husband presented as his own, because that was the only way anyone would pay attention. Robert Lockwood had taken credit for his wife's genius, and the guilt of that theft had eaten him alive. The puzzle was Eleanor's message to the world, her proof that she had existed, that she had mattered, that her mind had been capable of creating something no one else could understand. And then she disappeared, and the puzzle became something else entirely. Sarah's father wrote that he believed Eleanor had hidden something inside the puzzle before she vanished, something that explained what had really happened to her, but he'd never been able to solve it because he didn't truly understand how Eleanor's mind worked. Only someone who shared her way of thinking, someone who carried her legacy, could possibly unlock it. Sarah read that letter and felt something crack open inside her chest. For 30 years she'd tried to escape her mother's shadow, tried to build a life untouched by tragedy and mystery. But now, she understood that the puzzle wasn't just a mechanical enigma. It was her mother's voice, calling across decades, waiting for someone who could hear it. Sarah began studying the puzzle in secret. She found old photographs, examined news footage from the various attempts to solve it, read every academic paper that had been written about its structure. She worked on it at night, after her shifts cleaning office buildings, using the same analytical skills she'd once used in her engineering career, skills she'd abandoned after a workplace accident, left her with chronic pain and medical bills that destroyed her savings. Her husband had left her 5 years ago, unable to handle the financial stress and her growing obsession with what he called the family curse. Her daughter barely spoke to her anymore. He couldn't understand why her mother was wasting time on something that had already destroyed 2 generations of their family. Sarah didn't blame them. She sometimes didn't understand it herself, but every time she looked at photographs of the puzzle, she saw patterns that no one else had noticed, connections that only made sense if you understood that the creator wasn't thinking like a man, wasn't thinking like a traditional engineer or mathematician, but was thinking like Eleanor Lockwood, a woman who'd had to hide her brilliance, encode her truth, speak in a language that only those who truly listened could understand. When Marcus Daniels announced he was reopening the puzzle challenge with that staggering $500 million reward, Sarah knew it was time. She applied under her married name, Mitchell, and was rejected immediately. She didn't have the credentials, didn't have the academic pedigree, didn't have any of the markers that the selection committee was looking for. So, she found another way in. She got a job with the cleaning service that handled the conference center. She waited. She watched. She knew that someone like Marcus Daniels would never allow someone like her to attempt the puzzle unless she forced the issue, unless she made it impossible for him to refuse without looking like a hypocrite in front of hundreds of witnesses. And now here she was, alone in a small room with white walls and bright lights and cameras recording her every movement, sitting across from the puzzle that had destroyed her family, the puzzle that held her mother's secrets. Sarah took a breath and began to work. The first thing she did surprised everyone watching from the monitoring room. She didn't touch the puzzle. For 2 hours, she just looked at it, studied it from every angle, made notes on a pad of paper they'd provided. Marcus Daniels watched the monitors with growing agitation. "What is she doing?" he muttered. "She's wasting time." But Sarah wasn't wasting time. She was reading. The symbols on the puzzle's surface weren't random decorations or meaningless encryption. They were a language, her mother's language, a system that Eleanor Lockwood had invented to express mathematical concepts that didn't exist in standard notation. Sarah had seen fragments of this language before in her mother's old notebooks, pages that her father had kept hidden away, pages that Sarah had discovered after his death. She'd spent years trying to decipher them, and now, looking at the puzzle, she understood that those notebooks had been preparation, a key to understanding this. The symbols told a story, not in words, but in pure conceptual relationships, in patterns that described emotional truth through mathematical precision. Sarah's hands moved over the puzzle's surface, not trying to solve it yet, just tracing the flow of ideas, following the narrative that her mother had encoded. And slowly, carefully, the story revealed itself. Eleanor Lockwood had known she was in danger. The puzzle showed it, hidden in the relationships between variables, encoded in ratios that described fear and uncertainty. Someone had been watching her. Someone close. Someone who knew about her work and wanted it for themselves. The official story was that Robert Lockwood had created the puzzle as a tribute to his wife. But the truth was more complicated. Eleanor had built the puzzle as a safeguard, a way to preserve her work and document what was happening to her, knowing that if she simply told people, they wouldn't believe her. Women's words carried so little weight then, even less than they do now. But mathematics, engineering, physical proof, locked inside an impossible puzzle that would have to be believed. Sarah understood now why her father had never been able to solve it. He'd been looking for a logic puzzle, for a traditional cryptographic system, for something that functioned according to rules that made sense to masculine modes of thinking. But Eleanor hadn't built that kind of puzzle. She'd built something that required empathy, that required understanding the specific context of her life, her fears, her marriage, her work, her position as a woman whose genius was simultaneously essential and impossible in the world she'd inhabited. You couldn't solve it with pure logic. You had to feel your way through it, had to understand what it meant to be brilliant and invisible, to have knowledge that could change the world and no platform to share it from. Sarah's fingers found the first unlock mechanism 6 hours into her attempt. It was hidden in plain sight, a rotation that only made sense if you understood that the puzzle wasn't describing a linear progression, but a spiral, a pattern that feminine thinking often follows, moving in circles that double back and transform, rather than pushing forward in straight hierarchical lines. The puzzle shifted under her hands. A panel slid open, revealing a new layer underneath. Marcus Daniels stood up in the monitoring room. His face had gone pale. "How did she do that?" someone asked. "No one's ever gotten past the first layer." "I don't know," Daniels said, and his voice was tight. "I don't know." Sarah kept working. The second layer was more complex, more personal. It required understanding the specific dynamics of Eleanor and Robert's marriage, the way that Eleanor had been simultaneously loved and erased by a man who couldn't handle being less intelligent than his wife, who'd needed to claim her achievements as his own in order to maintain his sense of masculine competence. Sarah knew this dynamic. She'd seen it in her own marriage, The way her husband had been threatened by her analytical abilities, had needed her to be less than she was in order for him to feel adequate. It was an old story. Ancient, really. The story of brilliant women diminished by the men who claimed to love them. The puzzle asked a question that wasn't written in any conventional sense, but Sarah understood it anyway. It asked, what do you do when the person who's supposed to protect you becomes the person you need protection from? Sarah's hands moved across the mechanisms with growing confidence. She understood now. Her mother hadn't disappeared because of some external threat, some random violence or terrible accident. She'd disappeared because of her husband, because of Sarah's own father, the man who'd spent 3 decades pretending to search for her while knowing exactly where she'd gone. The puzzle was a confession and an accusation, hidden so thoroughly that only someone who understood both parties, who'd lived in that house, who'd experienced that particular configuration of love and betrayal and intellectual theft, could possibly decode it. Hour 12. Sarah unlocked the 3rd layer. Hour 15. The 4th layer opened, revealing mechanisms so complex that the engineers watching from the monitoring room couldn't understand how they functioned. We couldn't comprehend how such precision could have been achieved with 1,980 seconds technology. Hour 18. Sarah's hands were shaking from exhaustion, but she didn't stop. She could feel her mother's presence in the puzzle, could feel Eleanor speaking to her across 30 years of silence, trusting that eventually someone would hear, someone would understand, someone would care enough to listen to a dead woman's encrypted testimony. The puzzle was asking for something specific now, not a code, not a mechanical solution. It wanted emotional truth, wanted acknowledgement of what had really happened, wanted someone to say out loud what everyone had pretended not to know. Sarah leaned close to the puzzle and whispered, "He killed you. Robert Lockwood killed his wife because he couldn't stand that she was smarter than him, because he needed her work but couldn't tolerate her presence, because he was a small man who could only feel big by destroying the woman who'd made him seem important." The puzzle trembled. Something deep inside, its mechanism shifted. Hour 20. Sarah's fingers found the final sequence. It wasn't mathematical anymore, wasn't mechanical. It was pure pattern recognition, requiring her to understand the precise emotional wavelength of her mother's fear and her mother's love, her mother's hope that someday, somehow, the truth would emerge. Sarah aligned the final components. There was a sound like a sigh, like something that had been holding its breath for 30 years, finally exhaling. The puzzle opened. Inside was a letter, handwritten on paper that had yellowed but remained intact. A photograph of Sarah as a child, proof that Eleanor had been thinking of her daughter even at the end. A diagram that showed the layout of the Lockwood estate, with a specific location marked in red, and a small USB drive. Anachronistic for the 1,980 seconds, but somehow present anyway, suggesting that Eleanor had updated the puzzle's contents multiple times over the years, right up until she couldn't anymore. Sarah lifted these items from the puzzle's interior with shaking hands. The letter was addressed to whoever solved it, thanking them, trusting them to understand what needed to be done. The diagram's marked location was in the woods behind the Lockwood estate, coordinates preserved with mathematical precision. And the USB drive, when it would eventually be examined, contained Eleanor Lockwood's complete life's work, mathematical proofs and engineering designs that were still decades ahead of current technology, work that would revolutionize 3 different fields, work that she'd hidden away knowing that her husband would claim it as his own if he ever found it. But more than that, the drive contained a video diary. Eleanor Lockwood, speaking directly to the camera, documenting her husband's escalating violence, his threats, his rage at being exposed as a fraud who'd built his career on his wife's stolen genius. She documented the night he'd told her he couldn't let her leave, couldn't let her reveal the truth, couldn't let her destroy everything he'd built on the foundation of her unacknowledged brilliance. The video ended with Eleanor saying she was going to hide, going to disappear, going to protect her work and her daughter the only way she knew how. She looked directly into the camera and said, "If you're watching this, if someone solved my puzzle, then you know the truth now. My daughter, Sarah, if this is you, I'm so sorry I had to leave, but I need you to know that everything I did to keep you safe from him. Tell them where to look. Tell them what he did. Don't let him win." The timer reached hour 24. The puzzle had been solved with minutes to spare. Security rushed into the room to find Sarah Mitchell sitting at the table, tears streaming down her face. The puzzle opened before her, its contents laid out like evidence at a crime scene. In the monitoring room, Marcus Daniels stood frozen. He'd gone absolutely white. Someone asked him if he was all right, and he didn't respond. His hands were trembling. When news broke that the puzzle had been solved, the media response was instantaneous and overwhelming. Within hours, Sarah Mitchell's face was on every news channel, every website, every social media platform. The cleaning woman who'd solved the impossible, the underdog who'd defeated the experts, the human interest story that people couldn't get enough of. But the story changed when the contents of the puzzle became public knowledge. When Eleanor Lockwood's video diary was released, when police went to the coordinates marked on the diagram and found what had been buried there for 3 decades, they found Eleanor Lockwood's remains. Not where she'd expected to be found, but close enough. The forensic evidence was degraded but conclusive. Blunt force trauma, buried in secret, hidden on property that Robert Lockwood had owned, that had passed to his estate, that had eventually been sold to new owners who'd never known what was beneath their garden. Robert Lockwood had murdered his wife and spent 30 years pretending to search for her, pretending to be consumed by grief, when in reality he was consumed by guilt and fear and the knowledge that she'd been smarter than him even in death, that she'd found a way to speak despite his attempts to silence her. But the story didn't end with Robert Lockwood. He'd been dead for 16 years. The real question became, why had Marcus Daniels bought the puzzle? Why had he brought it back into public view? Why had he offered such an enormous reward to anyone who could solve it? The answer took 3 weeks to uncover. But when it came out, it completed the picture in ways that made Sarah feel sick. Marcus Daniels wasn't just a tech billionaire. He was Robert Lockwood's illegitimate son from an affair that had happened years before Robert met Eleanor. He'd grown up knowing his father only from a distance, had built his career using technology that was suspiciously similar to concepts that Eleanor Lockwood had pioneered decades earlier. When Robert Lockwood died, he'd left everything to Marcus Daniels, including notes about the puzzle, including knowledge of what was really hidden inside it. Marcus had spent years trying to solve it himself, desperate to access Eleanor's work, to claim the revolutionary concepts that were locked away, to complete his father's legacy of intellectual theft. But he couldn't solve it. No one could. So he'd made it public, offering an absurd reward, hoping that eventually someone would crack it and he could access the contents, claim them. Somehow, maintain the illusion that these ideas came from the Lockwood family rather than from the woman that family had murdered. He'd never expected that the person who solved it would be Sarah Mitchell, would be Sarah Lockwood, would be Eleanor's daughter, the one person in the world who had both the intellectual capacity to understand the puzzle and the moral authority to decide what happened to its contents. When investigators examined Marcus Daniels's finances and communications, they found evidence that he'd been planning to claim Eleanor's work as a rediscovered Lockwood archive, that he'd already drafted press releases and patent applications, that he'd built an entire strategy around positioning himself as the guardian of his father's legacy. The $500 million reward had been a calculated investment. He'd expected to make billions from Eleanor's innovations. Instead, he'd inadvertently engineered his own exposure. Sarah ensured that every piece of her mother's work was published under Eleanor Lockwood's name, that every patent and every paper credited her properly, that the world finally understood who the real genius had been. The mathematical proofs alone would have been enough to secure Eleanor's legacy, but combined with the story of her murder and the 30-year cover-up, combined with the revelation of how thoroughly her work had been stolen and suppressed, it became a cultural watershed. Universities established research positions in Eleanor's name. Technology companies scrambled to implement her designs, finding that concepts she'd developed in the 1,980 seconds were still more elegant and efficient than anything modern engineers had created. Feminist historians wrote books about her, about the specific ways that brilliant women were erased, about how many Eleanor Lockwoods might exist in history, women whose work was claimed by men, whose murders or disappearances were never properly investigated because their lives were considered less valuable than maintaining masculine reputations. Marcus Daniels was arrested and charged with obstruction of justice and conspiracy to commit fraud. He fought the charges, maintained his innocence, claimed he'd only wanted to honor his father's memory, but the evidence was overwhelming, and more importantly, public opinion had turned completely against him. The case went to trial 8 months after Sarah solved the puzzle. She testified for 3 days, describing her childhood, her mother's brilliance, her father's jealousy and violence, the decades she'd spent trying to understand what had really happened. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding Marcus Daniels guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. The $500 million reward, which he'd tried to contest paying, was eventually transferred to Sarah in full. She donated most of it, established a foundation in her mother's name to support women in STEM fields, particularly those working in environments where their contributions weren't recognized, set up scholarships, funded research, made sure that Eleanor Lockwood's name would be attached to positive change rather than just tragedy. She kept enough to secure her own future, to help her daughter, to finally stop cleaning office buildings at night and start sleeping without pain medication. The puzzle itself was donated to the Smithsonian, where it sits now in a climate-controlled case, opened permanently, its mechanisms visible so that anyone can see the extraordinary precision of Eleanor's engineering. Next to it is a plaque that tells Eleanor's story, that names her as the creator, that explains what she'd hidden inside and why. School groups visit it. Engineering students study it. People stand in front of it and try to understand how someone could encode so much truth in metal and mathematics, how someone could speak across decades through pure precision and pattern. Sarah visits it sometimes, stands there looking at the thing that killed her father, that exposed his crimes, that gave her mother a voice after 30 years of silence. She thinks about the women whose brilliance is still being stolen, still being suppressed, still being erased by men who need to feel superior. She thinks about the patterns that repeat across history, the same violence in new configurations. And she thinks about the fact that it took her, a cleaning woman, someone invisible and underestimated, to solve what all the celebrated geniuses had failed to solve. Not because she was smarter than them, though she was certainly smart enough, but because she was willing to listen to a dead woman's voice, to understand that brilliance doesn't always speak in the languages that institutions recognize, to believe that someone who'd been erased might still have something crucial to say. 2 years after the trial, Sarah was invited to speak at a conference for women in technology. She stood on a stage, no longer wearing a cleaning service uniform but dressed in clothes she'd chosen herself, and told her mother's story to an audience of thousands. At the end, someone asked her what it had felt like in that room, alone with the puzzle, knowing that the whole world was watching and expecting her to fail. Sarah thought about it for a moment. Then she said, "It felt like coming home. Like my mother was there with me, showing me how she thought, teaching me the language she'd invented to speak truth that no one wanted to hear." Every woman in this room knows that language, whether we realize it or not. We've all had to encode our knowledge in ways that others would accept, hide our brilliance behind more palatable presentations, speak in tongues that institutions recognize even when they don't fully understand. She paused, looking out at the audience, seeing faces of every age and background, women who'd fought their own battles with erasure and theft and the specific violence of being brilliant in a world that preferred them diminished. The puzzle wasn't unsolvable, she said. It was just waiting for someone who knew how to listen. And I think there are puzzles like that everywhere. Voices that have been locked away, truths that have been buried, women who are still waiting for someone to hear them. We solve those puzzles not by being the smartest people in the room, but by being willing to honor the intelligence of people that history tried to forget. The audience stood and applauded, and Sarah let herself feel something she hadn't felt in decades. Pride, not in having solved an impossible puzzle, but in having helped her mother speak one final time, in having made sure that Eleanor Lockwood's voice would never be silenced again. The puzzle taught her something that she carries with her still, that the most important mysteries aren't the ones that brilliant people create to prove their genius. They're the ones that desperate people create to survive, to document, to ensure that truth doesn't die with them. And those mysteries can only be solved by people who understand what it means to be erased, to be invisible, to be dismissed as ordinary when you're anything but. In the end, Sarah Mitchell, born Sarah Lockwood, solved the puzzle no genius could crack because she understood something those geniuses never learned, that the hardest locks to pick are the ones that protect not treasure, but testimony, that the most complex codes are the ones that translate not information, but experience, and that, sometimes the person who looks least qualified to solve an impossible problem is exactly the person who's been training for it their entire life, learning the language of invisibility and erasure, becoming fluent in the silence that brilliant women are forced to speak. Her mother had been murdered for refusing that silence. But through her puzzle, through her impossible, beautiful, terrible creation, Eleanor Lockwood had found a way to speak anyway. What do you think was really inside that puzzle, beyond the physical evidence? Was it just documentation of a crime, or was it something more? A mother's last gift to a daughter, a woman's final act of resistance against the forces that tried to erase her. And what would you have done in Sarah's place? Would you have had the courage to step forward, to risk public humiliation, to attempt something that had destroyed everyone who'd tried before you? Subscribe for more real-life stories, with twists that will leave you speechless. Stories about the invisible people who change history, about the voices that refuse to be silenced, about the puzzles that wait decades for someone who knows how to listen.